Well, tonight, as you've just heard, has been Anthony Albanese's night, the budget address in reply, it's called. I could tell many stories, but I will tell you this one. I once wrote a draft of a budget address in reply for the then federal opposition leader, Malcolm Fraser. I remember it clearly. It was 1975. After the budget was brought down by the then Treasurer, Bill Hayden, I presented my written response as a draft to 4 leading figures assembled in the opposition leader's office. As I tentatively presented my piece of work, one said, "Don't worry about that, Alan. We'll be rejecting the whole thing." And there began the constitutional crisis and the subsequent dismissal of the then Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. However, notwithstanding Mr Albanese's performance tonight, and he's very sincere, childcare is most probably the centrepiece of what he said, and childcare is a massive family cost. One young man who works for me here is paying $143 a day for childcare, and he's not on big money. Now, admittedly, that is currently subsidised. Labor has said tonight what they said in the last budget speech. They'll provide, or budget in reply, they'll provide a non-means tested 90% subsidy of all childcare costs. Now, in this political world, where money doesn't seem to matter unless you're throwing it away, on Tuesday night, the government said they'd provide a 95% childcare subsidy, but only to the second and third child. So if you don't feel guilty about having a handout, the Labor childcare package is superior. Mr Albanese also has a point about wage growth, or should I say no wage growth. But let me say this. Nothing Labor has done or offered since the last election, when Bill Shorten was beaten, nothing suggests Labor is worthy of being allowed to occupy the Treasury benches. You can cite polls and everything else. The fact that the Morrison government is technically a minority government, and Albanese needs to win 8 seats to form majority government. Note this, by the way. At the last federal election, the Liberals won 11 out of 16 seats in WA, yet the Liberals have just been walloped at a state election. The Coalition won 23 out of 29 seats in Queensland. Consider this, and it explains the cash splurge on Tuesday night, money for everyone. You see, in Queensland and WA, at the last federal election, the Coalition won 34 seats. In the whole of Australia, they only won 77. So in the other 106 seats away from Queensland and WA, the Coalition won 43. Scott Morrison has a massive mountain to climb to win again. Albanese has to win 8 seats to form a majority government. Scott Morrison has to hang on to everything he already has. And with McCormack leading the National Party, the Coalition has little traction in the bush without Barnaby Joyce and Matt Canavan leading the charge. But in terms of what I'm about to say next, if you forget the numbers, which can be intimidating, Labor have not done anywhere near enough to prosecute their entitlement to form government. That said, the case presented by the Treasurer on Tuesday night merits analysis. He was at pains yesterday to defend himself from the charge of spending, debt and deficit by arguing that the budget was consistent with the Menzies tradition. In other words, allegedly a deficit in 24-25 of just $57 billion and a net debt in 24-25 of $980 billion, gross debt anywhere over $1 trillion, and this is the Menzies tradition. Now, it's true that Menzies pitched a lot of his rhetoric towards home ownership, but even the interest rates where they are and the proposal that single parents buying a house with a 2% deposit for a $400,000 home, I mean, where do you get them? You'd still need $8,000. So how many takers will that have? But back to Menzies, it's true that Menzies also ran deficits, but with this philosophical proviso, and I quote Menzies, "We've been like a citizen who for 2 years spends more than he earns and has, in consequence, used up about half his savings in the bank. That citizen, if he's sensible, will recognise that the process cannot go on, that he must stop it either by earning more or spending less or both. Unless he does this," says Menzies, "when his savings have disappeared, he'll either be forced into painful economies or will become bankrupt," unquote. That's why an analysis which asks, how much is there in this budget, for me, obscures the most important question. Won't government have to take from me down the track big lumps of money to pay for what they are giving me today? The difference is those who are throwing around the borrowed money today are not the ones who will have to pay it back tomorrow. As the former Treasury official Stephen Anthony has said, quote, "We can't expect budget surpluses until the next generation, within 20 years, maybe longer." That's why he said I called it a vandal's budget, because it really is an assault on the sustainability of the Commonwealth budget, unquote. Now, what he's saying is we're going to be in deficit long after coronavirus is over, and no matter how much the economy bounces back. The UBS economist George Tharanou makes the point that the, quote, only $57 billion deficit for 24-25 is larger than was forecast in the Treasury update of December. Larger, more debt. But we were told on Tuesday night that there's been an economic rebound since December, $104 billion over 5 years. But of course, to win an election, that and more has been promised and given away. Is this seriously a Menzies budget that behaves this way? As Stephen Anthony says, it's essentially creating leaking buckets all over the economy that will never fill and therefore never collect revenue in the future. Now, I admit that tax cuts are important, unemployment benefits, childcare measures, aged care, long overdue, but these are not one-off expenses. They go on and on. Recurrent is the word they use. And it's not as though other real problems have been addressed, notwithstanding this massive spendathon. Josh Frydenberg said about his own children that his way of helping them was to, quote, avoid long-term unemployment, unquote. Josh, not a word about little kids today still paying off debt, if they ever will, 30 and 40 years from now. And if interest rates go up, as they surely will, what will be the debt burden then? We can't escape the certain truth that there was no need to put us in an economic coma in the first place. We're sailing on an ocean of debt, and no amount of rhetoric in relation to phenomenal spending and sending gross debt well past $1 trillion, no amount of rhetoric can argue that this is faithful to the Menzies tradition. As Menzies says, quote, we don't believe there is some mystic financial formula by which you can raise and spend money without debt and without taxation. So which is it to be? Would an economics student in a first-year university class really think that $161 billion in deficit this year is small? That's another $6,000 that every Australian owes to Canberra, and you pay interest on it. And that's just for this year. And how do we know those figures are right? Last December, Treasury predicted a $180 billion deficit. Is May's figures of $161 billion more credible than December's figure? Yet in spite of all of this, we're told not to expect overseas students and tourists until 2023. Though I must say Gladys Berejiklian has said New South Wales will begin accepting international students within months. Police and health officials in New South Wales have signed off on a plan for international arrivals using a quarantine system likely to be paid for by the university sector. But the tourism sector looks grim. Nothing in the budget provides a roadmap out of the crisis they face. There was nothing in the budget for the tourism industry other than what's already been announced. But don't worry, plenty of money for the public service in this budget that, according to the Treasurer, represents the Liberal Party's enduring values. The Liberal Party used to be about limiting the public sector and growing the private sector. Now, while tourism can't keep workers and hospitality and agriculture can't find workers, nearly 5,400 extra staff will be added to the Commonwealth Public Service next financial year. 5,400, bringing the total to 174,300, according to the budget papers. Cost $78 billion. Menzies would be pushing the timber off the top of his coffin. In the economy, in the economic coma that we've been through, this lot haven't lost a cent, have they? Now, one of the share markets slumped 52 points yesterday, its biggest two-day fall in 2.5 months. Qantas tumbled 3.4%. Flight Centre 4.5% because the tourism industry feels abandoned and there was no border certainty in the federal budget. And just on tourism and borders, what's going on? Border Force tell us today that 134,758 Australian citizens and permanent residents have received exemptions for overseas travel. 134,758. 14,000 have been allowed to leave the country more than once, some departing and returning 5 times. 37,000 came and went for compassionate reasons. Almost 14,000 returned home from overseas more than once between March 20 last year and April 20 this year. Where does the threat of coronavirus fit into those figures? And one word missing from Tuesday's budget, China. In the budget papers, barely a mention, when there are trade sanctions in place everywhere. You address the China problem by not mentioning it. But apparently a $270 billion over 10 years in defence spending has offended China. Tough luck. We're also told the government has doubled school funding since they came to office. But as I said last night, the results get worse. And what about those people who've saved all their lives in order not to be dependent on the taxpayer or not to be reliant on welfare? The self-funded retirees, what are they getting for their money? The drawdown rules are still in place. They're earning virtually nothing on their investments. Just look at the interest rates. But they've got to draw on their capital to survive. There's not one person in government who's uttered a syllable in support of self-funded retirees, yet they are national heroes. They don't have their hand out. My point is simple. Labor have done nothing to earn government. But I don't think taxpayers take too kindly to the Treasurer talking about a strong economy and the budget document representing the Liberal Party's, quote, enduring values, or this is what the coalition stands for. Perhaps the Prime Minister himself deserves the final say. He tweeted on May 31, 2009, and I quote, ScoMo is sick and resting up. Diagnosis, Rudd flu, brought on by the copious amounts of public debt, unquote. It's strange, isn't it, with politicians, when it suits, the wind suddenly blows in a different direction. What do you think? Email me, alan@skynews.com.au, or the text line 0414 000 848.